Hello and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at another boss from 7.3 PTR, and we're looking at Imonar the Soul Hunter in Antorus the Burning Throne.
So this boss is roughly 6th within the instance, and it takes place on 2 platforms that are connected by a bridge. And over the course of the 3 phases that this fight consists of, the boss will alternate between each of the platforms. Now, although this boss has simple mechanics, it makes up for it by being quite a short fight, as well as having an insanely cool transition, because when the boss changes phases, you have to move along the bridge between the platforms and avoid a bunch of traps and explosives and fire, as well as orbs that come rolling down towards you.
Now, before we jump into the fight, do note that this footage is from the PTR, so things are subject to change, although they usually don't change too much. Either way, there is going to be a live guide for this fight once Antorus reaches live servers. So let's kick straight into it and look at phase 1, where you'll be fighting the boss on the first platform.
Now for the tanks, you'll need to deal with Shock Lance. This deals a big burst of damage and applies a 20-second debuff, which increases all physical damage you take by 10% per stack. Additionally, each stack that you have will also cause you to frequently shock a random raid member for a burst of nature damage. So on 1 stack you'll only hit a single player, but on 5 stacks you'll be bursting out damage onto 5 players. You'll want to taunt off each other each time your debuff drops, just to keep incoming tank damage and raid damage low, and this is usually around the 3 to 4 stack mark. For the raid to deal with is pulse grenades. On a timer, the boss will throw out a few grenades at the location of random non-tank players. If you stand in these as they land or walk into them afterwards, you'll take a burst of nature damage, be knocked back, and also gain a debuff that increases all nature damage you take by 50% for 20 seconds. Any grenades that you do not run into will stay up forever, meaning that the platform will not only have grenades scattered everywhere by the end of phase 1, but they'll also be there when you return back to this platform in phase 3. So you want to have these grenades stacked up as cleanly as possible. You can do this by having all your ranged and melee players stack up and move along the edges of the platform each time they come in. This for us worked fine and is pretty easy to pull off, but unfortunately the other ability in this phase throws a bit of a spanner in the works, and this is the sleep canister. The boss will throw out a debuff onto 2 random raid members, and this will put them to sleep for 20 seconds. When this debuff times out, or when it is dispelled, the player will stun all other players within 8 yards of them for 10 seconds, and this effect is not dispellable. So if you're stacked up on top of each other and a person is dispelled, they will stun absolutely everyone nearby. You are, however, given a few seconds notice if the debuff is about to be applied to you. You can use this short window to run 10 yards away from your group, and then you could be safely dispelled. But this requires extremely fast reaction times, and it's likely that you won't always get far enough away, and you're just going to send half your raid to sleep. So another way of doing this phase is by having your range spread 10 yards apart from one another, whilst melee players quickly just move away from any players that have sleep canisters. And as soon as the debuffs go out, you can pretty much just instantly dispel them. This does, however, mean that the grenades are going to be a little bit more messy. However, if you have good damage in this phase, you can still leave enough space for you to use in phase 3. And if you do have an absolutely insane amount of mines, and it's covering the majority of the platform, you can have players slowly clear them up simply just by running into them. But do keep in mind before you even try it, immunities will only give you damage reduction. They do not make you immune to the knockback effect or the debuff that you get afterwards. So if you have a single player clear all of the mines, he's probably just going to die at a later point because he's taking so much additional nature damage. But regardless, whatever strategy you do decide to use in phase 1, whether you're stacked up the entire time or you have your range spread, once you get the boss to 66% health, he will fly off to the other platform, leaving a ton of traps on the bridge as he flies off.
Now you need to get to him and interrupt his conflagration channel to enter phase 2, but also he'll be dealing tons of ticking damage to the raid, as well as gaining a stacking damage increase which lasts 20 seconds. You can't let this stack up too high, so it's important that he's interrupted quickly. Now running over to him is easier said than done, as the platform is coated in 2 different traps, and these traps last until triggered or until the boss dies. You'll have some pulse grenades which act in the same way as they do during phase 1, as well as stasis traps. When triggered, these will deal damage and stun anyone nearby, however the stun aspect is dispellable. On top of this, you'll have orbs travelling down the platform, and if you're hit by these, you'll take a burst of damage as well as be slowed by 50% for 8 seconds. And on heroic, you'll have fire along the sides of the bridge, which leaves a nasty damage taken increase on you for a whole minute. So yeah, never go into the fire. Movement speed increases are great here, such as like a stampeding roar, just to make it so people can get across quicker. Classes with mobile immunity, such as hunters and paladins, can run into traps and help clear a path if the whole bridge is blocked off. However, as Loz said, you can't immune any of the trap effects. You'll still be knocked back or you'll still be stunned. Healers will just need to be quick to dispel these immune players that are clearing the path for you. Now you may have a cheesy idea in your head that you could have all players move across the bridge before the intermission even begins, so you can just interrupt the boss immediately and completely ignore the bridge traps. This will not work, as anytime you're not on the same platform as the boss during a phase, he'll spam you with rockets which deal a ton of damage as well as debuff you, making it so you take even more damage. So yeah, never leave the same platform the boss is on. Either way, once you've managed to get to the boss and interrupt his conflag, he'll enter phase 2.
The boss has 3 brand new abilities in this phase that replaces old ones. For the tanks, you'll now have to deal with Sever. This deals a burst of damage and applies a stacking 18-second dot. You want to have active mitigation up for the initial hit and then taunt off each other when your debuff drops. For the raid, you'll need to deal with Shrapnel Blast. This places mines at the location of several players, and if you run into these mines, it'll do a burst of raid-wide damage and also apply dots. For this ability, we decided to group up and move around as 2 teams, one for ranged and one for melee, although in hindsight you could definitely move as one big group if you wanted to, and as soon as the mines do come in, we just sidestep them. Simple as that. And the final ability that you need to deal with in this phase is Charged Blasts. This will cause 2 small ships to spawn at the side of the room, and each of these ships will then fixate a beam on a player. After 7 seconds, the beam will explode, dealing a bunch of damage, leaving a dot, and also knocking back anyone who was in that direction. We had the targeted players move out of the group and attempt to face the beams away from the raid, while also making sure that they're not too close to the edges because you can be knocked off the platforms. Overall, this ability isn't too difficult to deal with, however it would actually be made a lot easier if the rest of the raid could actually see the beam rather than just the targeted players. However, after testing Heroic, we did go and do Mythic and we could see the beam there, so we assume that it's now been added to Heroic as well. But that's all you need to do for this phase. Move around as a group, and each time the mines spawn, just move away from them, make sure the beams don't hit the raid, and make sure that you don't get knocked off. And once you get the boss to 33%, the second intermission will begin.
Now the boss will fly back to the first platform, and once again you need to get to him and interrupt his conflagration before the damage gets too high. This time the boss has scattered even more traps for the raid to deal with, alongside any of the old traps from the previous transition. He'll add Blast Wires, which deal a burst of damage to the raid when triggered, and Shrapnel Blast, which deal damage and apply a dot to anyone nearby when they are triggered. This can make navigating your way back through the traps pretty difficult, especially as the orbs, which now apply a dot, come rolling towards you. This is a perfect time for a single player to clear a path for everyone else. You want to make sure that when you're moving along the platform, you choose the least disruptive traps to clear to make your path. Stasis traps are a fairly good choice because the stun effect can be dispelled, so you just have a single player run into it to clear it, and then have a healer just dispel that player and everyone can move on. Now as this transition is likely to take much longer than the previous one, it is best that you have a healing cooldown or 2 available to combat the large amount of incoming damage. Things like Tranquility, Aura Mastery and Revival are really good, as you can do a significant amount of healing whilst on the move. Once you do eventually get to the other side, you want to make sure you interrupt him, and then phase 3 will begin. During this phase you'll be dealing with 3 empowered abilities from both phase 1 and phase 2. Empowered Shock Lance works the same way as the standard Shock Lance, except the debuff is permanent. This not only means that the tanks will be taking ever increasing damage, but so will the raid. Due to the ramping damage you take from this ability, we decided to lust phase 3 just to make sure the boss would die before we did. Empowered Pulse Grenade will now apply a 46-second long debuffs to a few targets, rather than put anything on the ground. These targets will deal pulsing damage to themselves and anyone within 5 yards, as well as knocking back anyone who is nearby. You want to have these players stand away from anyone else, as otherwise people will be bouncing all over the place and potentially land in some of the standard pulse grenades that are left over from phase 1. We decided to try and place the grenade players at the edge of the room, whilst the undebuffed players hang around in the middle. The last thing you'll need to deal with is Empowered Shrapnel Blast, which will bombard the platform with a bunch of small swirly circles. Getting hit by one of these will deal a nasty burst of damage to you and apply a permanent dot which stacks. So you just want to avoid these circles as much as you possibly can. Fortunately, there is usually a fair amount of space between them that you can quickly move to. But that's honestly it for phase 3. Aside from a somewhat tight damage check, the last phase isn't really much of a problem. So let's jump into feedback. There isn't really much to critique here.
No, it feels like a really solid fight. Playing it was definitely fun. It feels a bit strange that phase 1 seems to be the hardest phase in terms of strategy, as you kind of want to stack up but also be spread out at the same time. But to be fair, with timers, this phase will probably be a lot easier, as you'll be able to do both, essentially. When you get the crossovers, when you have both the mines and the canister at the exact same time, you can just already be pre-spread for it. But the single-handed best part of the fight, of course, is the intermission. Running from one platform to another is extremely fun, and I'm so glad that they made it so you can't really cheese it.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you can use immunities. Immunities are still very strong here because it prevents you from dying, but you still get knocked back, you still get hit by the traps. If you run into one of the lasers, you're still going to do a burst of damage to the entire raid. So, you know, you still have to run the gauntlet regardless.
Yeah, I can't actually wait to see how, like, well guilds are going to be able to do this transition.
Well, you can do so many different strategies as well.
Like, I can see, like, warlock gateways and, like, speed totems, and maybe, like, you'll bring a couple of monks and do, like, mass revivals as everyone procs traps at once sort of thing. Like, that could be really, really cool. So, yeah, I can't wait to see how some of the top guilds do this on Mythic, especially because on Mythic, you have to jump between the platforms 4 different times because there's 5 phases rather than having to run across the bridge twice. And there's cooldown wins.
Yeah, there's cooldown wins as well.
On the platforms, at all times. God. Maybe it isn't going to be fun.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little boss preview, then please drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. But before we do go, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are awesome. All the support you guys give us is absolutely appreciated. Thank you so much. And we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.